Restaurant manager kicks out Barron Trump over MAGA hat. What he does next shocks everyone. The atmosphere inside the upscale restaurant was lively, filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses. The waiters moved efficiently, serving plates of gourmet dishes to the patrons seated at their tables. A modern, chic ambience dominated the space, with its sleek design and dim lighting. It was the perfect spot for a quiet evening or a celebratory meal. The door to the restaurant opened, and a sudden chill seemed to pass through the room. The staff paused briefly, their eyes flickering toward the entrance as a tall young man stepped inside, accompanied by a few bodyguards. His sharp suit and immaculate posture indicated he was someone of importance, but it was the MAGA hat perched on his head that caused several heads to turn. It was Barron Trump, the son of former President Donald Trump, quietly making his way into the restaurant, unaware of the stir his mere presence would cause. At a nearby table, a group of diners exchanged quick, discreet glances. They recognized him immediately, whispering to one another as their eyes followed Barron's every move. Barron kept his head slightly down, his expression neutral, but his steps were confident as he walked towards an empty table near the back of the room. From the corner of the restaurant, Henry, the restaurant manager, watched the young man with growing discomfort. Henry was known for his strict policies regarding decorum and behavior within his establishment. He prided himself on maintaining a sophisticated environment, and something about Barron's presence seemed to jar against the vibe he had worked so hard to cultivate. As Barron took his seat, a few of the staff members exchanged uneasy looks. A moment of silence hung in the air, and Henry felt a surge of irritation rise in him. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something about Barron's appearance, specifically that hat, seemed out of place in his restaurant. He could feel the unease spreading across the room, as if the entire establishment had collectively held its breath. Henry walked briskly toward Barron's table, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. He had dealt with high-profile individuals before, but something about this situation felt different. His face was expressionless, but his mind was already calculating the best way to handle the situation. When he reached Barron's table, he stopped, standing tall with his arms folded across his chest. Barron looked up, slightly surprised by the manager's sudden appearance. "Yes, sir?" Barron asked, his voice calm but wary. "I'm afraid we can't allow that hat in here," Henry said firmly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at the red, white, and blue brim. "It's against our policy to allow any kind of political attire in the restaurant. We aim to maintain a neutral, inclusive environment for all our guests." Barron blinked, taken aback by the manager's bluntness. He didn't expect this kind of reception, especially not at a place that appeared to be so upscale. He sat up straighter in his chair, adjusting the tie under his collar, but his demeanor was still calm, the way he had been raised to handle uncomfortable situations. "Excuse me?" Barron said, his voice growing more measured. "You're asking me to take off my hat?" Henry nodded, his arms still folded. "Yes, sir. I'm afraid that's the policy here. It's not about you personally, but our guests deserve a peaceful dining experience without any distractions." Barron's expression hardened, and he glanced around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the diners. Some of them were watching the exchange, but many tried to avoid making eye contact, pretending they hadn't noticed the confrontation unfolding. Henry could see the tension building in the air. "No," Barron said firmly, shaking his head slightly. "I'll keep it on." A silence lingered in the air for a brief moment before Henry spoke again. "I'm sorry, sir, but if you choose to keep the hat on, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The words landed like a slap across the room. Henry's voice was cold, but there was no hesitation in his actions. He had made the decision, and he wasn't about to back down. Barron stared at him for a moment, his face unreadable. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him now, and the weight of their collective gaze pressed down on his shoulders. But there was something else, something deeper, gripping his chest. He had been raised in the public eye, accustomed to criticism, but he was not used to being told what he could and couldn't wear, especially in such a public setting. He looked down at his MAGA hat, then back up at Henry. His lips parted slightly, but he didn't speak. Instead, he stood up slowly from the table, his movements deliberate, as though weighing the situation in his mind. The bodyguards behind him shifted nervously, but they didn't make a move to intervene. The restaurant grew quiet as Barron adjusted his hat one last time before pulling it off his head. He held it in his hand, gripping it tightly, the fabric crinkling slightly between his fingers. For a moment, it seemed as though he might simply walk away. But then something unexpected happened. He turned to face Henry, his eyes narrowed but steady. "You're making a mistake," Barron said calmly. "You've made your decision. But don't think this is just about a hat." Henry raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this was going. The restaurant's patrons continued to watch, some pretending not to, but the tension in the room was palpable. Barron continued, his voice gaining strength with every word. "You think this is about politics, but it's not. This is about the freedom to express ourselves however we choose. It's about respecting everyone, regardless of their beliefs." Henry opened his mouth to retort, but Barron held up his hand. "I'm not going to argue with you," Barron said, his voice lowering slightly but still carrying authority. "I'm leaving, but you've lost a customer. And not just me. You've lost my family's business too. I'll make sure of it." As he turned to leave, a few of the diners exchanged glances, whispers beginning to ripple through the room. The tension was thick, but Barron's words hung in the air like a challenge, like a promise. Henry watched as Barron walked out of the restaurant, the door closing behind him with a soft chime. The silence that followed felt almost suffocating. He stood in place, his arms still crossed, as the murmurs of disbelief started to rise. The staff was uncertain, some of them were even sympathetic to Barron's words, while others felt they had witnessed an act of defiance that needed to be addressed. Then, to everyone's shock, Henry spoke. "I'll make sure this restaurant never hosts another Trump family member again. They're not welcome here." The words were cold, but they were final. He turned on his heel and walked toward the back office, leaving the room in stunned silence. As the door closed behind Barron Trump, the atmosphere in the restaurant remained electric with disbelief. The other patrons, who had watched the altercation unfold with bated breath, were now buzzing with quiet conversations. The tension in the air was thick, as though the room had been permanently altered by the event that had just transpired. A few whispered voices started to emerge, murmuring their opinions in hushed tones. Some supported Barron's right to wear the MAGA hat, others sided with Henry's decision to uphold the restaurant's policy. But the one thing that everyone seemed to agree on was that what had just happened was unprecedented, something that had shocked the whole restaurant. Meanwhile, in the back office, Henry stood in front of his desk, his fingers gripping the edge tightly. He was seething, his anger growing by the second. He had done what he believed was right for the restaurant, for the patrons who came to his establishment expecting a certain atmosphere, but now he was questioning himself. The more he replayed the conversation in his mind, the more his conviction began to waver. Did he really make the right choice? "Henry, what just happened out there?" one of his staff members, Martha, asked, standing in the doorway. Her face was a mixture of confusion and concern. "Are you sure that was the best way to handle things?" Henry didn't immediately respond. He sat down in his chair, staring at the floor, as the weight of the situation began to sink in. He had stood by his decision, but now, in the quiet aftermath, he couldn't help but feel the backlash of the moment. This was Barron Trump, a figure who couldn't be easily ignored or dismissed. "I did what I thought was right," Henry muttered, his voice tight. He had no business walking in here wearing that hat. "But it wasn't just the hat, was it?" Martha replied, walking into the office and sitting across from him. "It's about what that hat represents to a lot of people. It's not just about politics, Henry. It's about values, about freedom of expression." Henry's face tightened. "I'm not going to allow a political symbol to dictate what happens in my restaurant. This place is supposed to be a haven for people to come together, to escape the noise of the outside world." Martha sighed, her gaze softening as she watched Henry wrestle with his emotions. "I understand what you're saying, but I don't know if kicking him out was the right way to go about it. You've made a statement, but I'm not sure it's the statement you wanted to make." Henry leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I didn't think this would blow up like this. I just wanted to keep the peace. I didn't want to alienate anyone." Martha shook her head. "But that's exactly what you did. You've alienated a lot of people, whether you intended to or not. As Henry sat there, his thoughts swirling, he knew deep down that Martha was right. This wasn't just about the MAGA hat, it was about the implications of his actions. He had made a choice, one that would ripple far beyond this evening. And now, the restaurant was on the verge of a major public relations disaster. The next morning, the restaurant's phone rang off the hook. Calls came in from reporters, from customers, and from social media users eager to voice their opinions. The event with Barron Trump had gone viral, and the reactions were swift and intense. The backlash was swift and unforgiving, especially from the side of Trump supporters who felt that Barron had been unfairly targeted. "I can't believe what happened last night," one customer said when Henry answered the phone. "I come to your restaurant because it's a place of neutrality, but what you did was just wrong. You kicked out Barron Trump. Do you realize who he is? He's the son of a former president." Henry felt the weight of the words, and with every call he took, his unease grew. The pressure was mounting, and he knew he had to make a decision, one that would determine the fate of the restaurant's reputation. Meanwhile, social media was ablaze. Posts supporting Barron Trump's right to wear the hat flooded Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Hashtags like #BoycottRestaurant and #JusticeForBarron trended nationally. It was clear that the controversy had sparked a firestorm, and there was no sign of it dying down anytime soon. But there was another side to the debate. Some applauded Henry's decision, praising him for standing firm in what they perceived as a battle for decency. A few patrons even spoke out in favor of the restaurant's policy, claiming that the establishment had a right to uphold its values in the face of such political spectacle. Back at the restaurant, Henry sat alone in his office, the door slightly ajar. His phone rested on his desk, still buzzing with notifications and calls he couldn't bring himself to answer. The weight of the decision was crushing, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was losing control of the very establishment he had worked so hard to build. David, one of his longtime employees, knocked on the door and entered, his expression cautious. "Henry, we need to talk," he said, his tone more serious than usual. Henry didn't look up from his desk. "What's done is done, David. There's no going back now." David stepped into the room, sitting across from him. "You don't know that for sure. We can still fix this." Henry let out a sigh, rubbing his forehead. "How? People are furious. I've got reporters hounding me, social media going wild, and customers threatening to leave. I'm trying to figure out where I went wrong." David shifted in his seat, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe you did what you thought was right in the moment, but this situation has become bigger than you realized. You've got people taking sides, both for you and against you. The real question is, how do you want to move forward?" Henry leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as though searching for an answer. He had been proud of the restaurant for so long, priding himself on creating a space where anyone could feel at home. Now, it felt like he had turned that vision upside down. "I don't want to back down from what I believe in," Henry said finally, his voice quieter. "But I also don't want to divide people. I don't want to lose everything we've built because of one decision." David nodded thoughtfully. "Then maybe it's time to make a statement. Maybe it's time to show people that the restaurant stands for something more than just a policy. It stands for understanding." Henry sat in his office, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The restaurant, once a thriving and neutral haven, now felt like a battleground. Every day that passed seemed to make the situation more intense, and he knew that something had to change. He couldn't keep running from it. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, he dialed a number he had been avoiding all day, the PR firm he had worked with for years. He needed guidance, someone who could help him navigate the mess he had created. The phone rang 3 times before a calm voice answered. "Hello, Henry. It's Emma. How can I help?" "Emma," Henry sighed, rubbing his eyes, "I've made a huge mistake." "What happened?" Emma's voice was steady, but there was a slight hint of concern. "I kicked out Barron Trump last night over a MAGA hat. The media's gone wild, and customers are starting to turn on us. People are boycotting the restaurant, and I'm not sure what to do next." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Emma spoke again. "Well, Henry, this is a tricky situation, to say the least. There are 2 sides to this. You've angered some people by enforcing your policy, but you've also received support for standing by what you believe in. The real question is, how do you want the restaurant to be viewed going forward? Henry leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. I don't know anymore. I want to uphold our values, but I also don't want to lose everything we've worked so hard to build. I understand, Emma said softly. But here's the thing. People love an apology when it's sincere. If you own your mistake, show vulnerability, and commit to making changes, you might just win back those you've lost. You need to let people know you're listening and that you value everyone who walks through your door, no matter what hat they wear. Henry's mind raced as he absorbed Emma's advice. It seemed simple enough, but the reality of implementing it felt overwhelming. How could he make a mistake like this disappear? The damage felt deep, but maybe it wasn't too late to turn things around. The next day, Henry stood in front of the restaurant, a deep sense of purpose settling over him. He had made a decision. He was going to apologize. He wasn't going to make excuses or hide behind pride. Instead, he was going to admit that he had let his emotions cloud his judgment and that, in doing so, he had failed the very customers he had sworn to serve. As he stepped inside, he was met with the usual buzz of the lunch rush, but there was an air of uncertainty in the room. A few familiar faces had come in, but most of the tables were empty, save for a handful of patrons who seemed to be watching him with judgment in their eyes. Henry walked to the front of the restaurant, standing behind the podium. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was focused. He had to do this. He had to make it right. Taking a deep breath, Henry cleared his throat. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to address something that happened recently, something that I deeply regret. Last night, a situation occurred that I now realize was handled poorly on my part. I asked a customer, Mr. Barron, to leave because of the MAGA hat he was wearing. This decision was based on a belief that our restaurant should maintain a neutral, respectful environment. He paused, watching the patrons as they listened intently. But in doing so, I failed to consider the bigger picture. I failed to see that we are not just a business, we are a community. A community that thrives on respect, understanding, and tolerance. I let my own values cloud my ability to see that, and for that, I apologize. There was a brief silence in the room, the kind that could be felt in the pit of your stomach. Henry's words hung in the air, and it felt like the entire restaurant was waiting for something, anything, that would signal whether his apology was genuine or simply another empty corporate statement. I've heard from many of you, both in support and in criticism, and I want to assure you that we are listening, Henry continued, his voice growing more steady with each word. Going forward, we will strive to create a space where all individuals, no matter their political beliefs, can feel welcome. We will not tolerate discrimination or exclusion, and we will continue to uphold the values of unity, respect, and equality. But more than that, I promise we will do better. Henry's gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of a few of the patrons who had been watching him. He wasn't sure what to expect, but what happened next took him by surprise. A single clap sounded from the back of the room, then another, until a few more voices joined in. It wasn't a full-blown standing ovation, but the applause was genuine, and the weight that had been pressing down on Henry's shoulders began to lift, bit by bit. As the applause died down, a familiar face in the crowd stood up, one of the loyal customers, an older woman who had been a patron for years. I believe in second chances, she called out, her voice carrying across the room. We all make mistakes, but it's how we own up to them that shows who we really are. You've earned my respect, Henry. Henry smiled, a weight lifting from his chest. The road to redemption was going to be long, but this was the first step. As the weeks passed, things began to settle. The restaurant slowly regained its regular customers. And while some people had made the decision to never return, many others were willing to give Henry another chance. The apology had been well received, and the changes he promised to implement were being put into action. But Henry knew this wasn't just about business, it was about integrity. It was about standing up for what was right, even when faced with difficult circumstances. He had learned an important lesson, that upholding his values didn't mean alienating others, and that leadership wasn't just about making the hard decisions, it was about being willing to admit when he had made a mistake. As for Barron, he never did return to the restaurant. But in a strange way, the event had shifted something within Henry. He realized that while the restaurant was a business, it was also a platform, one that could be used for more than just profit. It could be a place of community, of understanding, and most importantly, of respect. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but Henry had a newfound sense of purpose. He had been tested, and in the end, he had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to build a restaurant that would stand the test of time, built on the principles that mattered most. And as the sun set over the city that evening, Henry stood in front of the restaurant, taking a deep breath, knowing that the future was uncertain, but he was ready to face it. Months passed, and the restaurant began to regain its footing. The initial shock had worn off, and Henry's apology had worked its magic, at least in part. While some customers had stayed away, many others had returned, appreciating his honesty and the changes he'd promised to implement. It wasn't perfect, there were still lingering doubts and criticisms, but the restaurant was moving in the right direction. Henry had managed to steer his ship back on course, but he knew it wasn't enough to simply maintain the status quo. One crisp autumn morning, Henry sat in his office, reflecting on the lessons he'd learned from the past few months. The restaurant had always been a symbol of luxury and refinement, but it was time to make it something more. It needed to be a place where conversations could happen, where different perspectives could be shared, and where respect was at the forefront of every interaction. As Henry leaned back in his chair, a phone call interrupted his thoughts. It was from Emma, the PR expert who had guided him through the controversy. "Henry, I think we need to talk," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "There's something brewing, and it's time to make a decision." Henry's curiosity piqued. "What's going on?" "I've been hearing whispers about a new initiative," Emma continued. "It's something that could change the narrative, not just for your restaurant, but for your personal brand as well. It's a chance to redefine who you are and what your business represents." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of initiative?" "I think you should consider hosting a town hall event. An open dialogue, a conversation about politics, identity, freedom of expression, and unity. It's ambitious, but it could be exactly what the restaurant needs right now." Henry sat up straighter. "A town hall? What do you think it would accomplish?" "It would show the world that you're not just standing by your policies, you're willing to listen. You're open to discussion, even on tough topics. You have an opportunity to shift the conversation in a more positive direction." Henry's mind raced. He had made mistakes, but this could be a way to rebuild. It wasn't just about the hat, it was about showing that he could be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. "I'll think about it," Henry replied, his mind already working through the logistics. "Let me get back to you." As the days passed, Henry became more and more convinced that this town hall idea was the right way forward. It was a risk, of course, but in a world where divisions seemed to be growing by the day, it felt like the right moment to bring people together. The idea of fostering open communication and understanding was something that had always been at the core of the restaurant's values. Now, he had the chance to prove it. He called a meeting with his key staff to discuss the idea. Martha, David, and a few other trusted employees gathered in the conference room. Henry stood at the head of the table, looking at the faces of the people who had supported him through the storm. "I've been thinking a lot about the future," Henry began. "We've come a long way, and we're still moving forward. But I think it's time to do something big, something that shows people who we really are." Martha raised an eyebrow. "What do you have in mind?" "A town hall," Henry replied, his voice steady. "We'll invite members of the community, patrons, employees, and even some public figures. We'll host an open conversation about freedom of expression, political discourse, and finding common ground in a polarized world. It's time we lead the conversation, not just follow it." The room fell silent as his words sank in. Henry could feel the weight of the idea. It was ambitious, maybe even a little too bold for some people's tastes. But it could be the catalyst for something greater. David was the first to speak. "I like it. People need to see that we're not just a restaurant, we're a place where real conversations happen. A place where everyone's voice matters." Martha nodded slowly. "It's a risk, Henry. But sometimes, the greatest things come from taking risks." Henry smiled, feeling a sense of clarity wash over him. "I'm in. Let's make it happen." The team worked tirelessly for the next few weeks to prepare for the event. They coordinated with local politicians, community leaders, and social justice advocates. The town hall was going to be a diverse gathering, a platform where all opinions could be heard and respected. Invitations went out, social media campaigns were launched, and the buzz around the event grew. But with the excitement came the inevitable pushback. There were some who believed the event would be a PR stunt, others who feared that it would turn into a political battleground. But Henry knew that he couldn't control everything. The important thing was that the conversation was happening, that people were being given the opportunity to listen and learn. The night of the town hall event arrived, and the restaurant was transformed into a gathering space. The tables were cleared to make room for rows of chairs, and a stage had been set up in the center of the room. The lights were dimmed, and the atmosphere felt different. This wasn't just a dinner service, it was a moment. Henry paced backstage, running through his notes one last time. He could hear the chatter of the attendees outside, the mix of voices from people who were both excited and anxious. The turnout was impressive, and the energy was electric. He couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and dread. This wasn't just about serving food tonight, it was about serving a larger purpose. As he took his place at the podium, the crowd quieted. Henry looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some strangers, and took a deep breath. This was it. There was no turning back now. "Good evening, everyone," Henry began, his voice calm but commanding. "Thank you for joining us tonight. What we're doing here tonight is something special. It's not about politics, it's not about taking sides. It's about having a conversation. A real conversation about the issues that divide us and the values that can bring us together." The crowd listened intently, and for the first time in a long while, Henry felt truly connected to the people in the room. "We've spent too much time fighting each other. But if we're going to move forward, we need to start listening to each other, to our differences, to our shared humanity. Tonight is about listening. Tonight is about understanding. And I'm honored to have all of you here, because together, we have the power to change the conversation." The applause was immediate, and it filled the room with a sense of unity. Henry knew this was just the beginning, but he felt a surge of hope. This was more than just a restaurant. It was a platform for something bigger.